Hey everyone. You know, I was going to do this last year, but got so busy working that I never had a chance to do so. So I thought I'd probably do it now. And what I want to talk about here is, a crossover event that happened exclusively in Disney Adventures magazine a little over 20 years ago. This crossover event was called The Legend of the Chaos God. And it was a crossover event that involved 5 Disney afternoon shows in comic book form. Those shows were Tailspin, Rescue Rangers, Goof Troop, DuckTales, and Darkwing Duck. The main plot of the crossover was the fact that you had these two artifacts, a ruby, a red Chaos Ruby, and a medallion necklace. That if pieced together, they would release and free an immortal sorcerer known as Sulaco. Now, basically, the main portion of this crossover was the medallion and the ruby would always end up in the possession of one of these characters, or some of the characters involved in each of the crossovers. In the Tailspin crossover, it came into the possession of Hire for Hire. Long story short, it temporarily, Sulago, whose mind was trapped, believe it or not, in the ruby, Sulago temporarily ended up possessing Rebecca. Now, after a tussle and kind of a struggle, if you will, Baloo, Kit, and Molly were able to free Rebecca from Sulago's grasp and thus fly over the ocean and toss the ruby into the middle of the ocean. Now, the way they got possession of the ruby was a professor had basically done an exposition and hired them on to help him with that exposition in bringing the cargo back to Cape Suzette. Now, in the next story, which involves the Rescue Rangers, which involves the Chippendale Rescue Rangers, it takes place about 50 years later, from a storyline perspective. Now, basically what happens here is a character that looks similar to Dijon from the DuckTales show and movie is fishing, and somehow he finds the medallion. He finds the ruby, and I think the medallion or something like that, separate. So he takes them. He's temporarily possessed by Sulago, but he takes them, and they are somehow brought into the possession of Scrooge McDuck, who donates them to a museum, as far as I know. Now, it's at this museum where they're located at that Fat Cat tries to sneak in and steal them. But of course, he encounters the Rescue Rangers, and during this encounter, both Gadget, Dale, and then Fat Cat are temporarily possessed by Sulago. All wondering, and during these possessions, Sulago is wondering where the medallion is, because like I said, if he gets both the ruby and the medallion, he can basically be freed. Now he comes close at the end of the story by controlling Fat Cat, he becomes really close to being freed. But thanks to an electrical shock, it does not happen. Now, long story short, the Rescue Rangers bring on some crow friends named Edgar and Allan. Get it? Edgar Allan Poe, but just Edgar and Allan, and have them take the medallion and ruby and fly them to separate destinations. But it's during one of the crows flying that he accidentally drops the ruby. And this leads us right into the third chapter of the story, which involves Goof Troop. And basically what happens is the ruby falls into this smart car that this computerized smart car that Pete has bought and is having delivered to his house. Now, Goofy, of course, is the first to be suspicious about something going on, but Pete doesn't believe him until Pete sees it for himself. Now, they try to do everything they can to get rid of what's ever controlling the car. Now, it's during this time as well that the car finds out, or Sulago, by possessing the car, finds out that the medallion piece is in Duckburg and is been bought by Scrooge McDuck. So, long story short, Sulago tries everything in his grasp to get to Duckburg, even entrapping Pete and Goofy inside the car and forcing them to drive him to Duckburg. Of course, Goofy derails those plans. Both him and Pete jump out of the car, and the car goes over a cliff. Now, of course, the way Sulago makes his way to Duckburg is he calls up a towing company, says that the towing is being paid by Scrooge McDuck, and that leads us into the fourth chapter involving the DuckTales gang. Now, basically, Scrooge has no idea why this car is here and why he has to pay for the towing. Fenton Crackshell, of course, Gizmo Duck, alter ego, wonders the same thing, sees the ruby though, and ends up getting temporarily possessed by the ruby to the point that Sulago causes Fenton to call out to his Gizmo Duck suit, who uses his saying, which is blathering blatherskite or something like that. So basically he becomes Gizmo Duck, but Sulago sees the potential in the Gizmo suit, kicks Fenton out of the suit, and then controls the suit to go and confront Scrooge McDuck about the medallion. Now we find out that the medallion is in St. Canard. So Sulago uses the Gizmo suit, which I guess he takes to St. Canard or something like that. And that leads us into Chapter 5, because Chapter 5 is led into by the end of Chapter 4, in which Scrooge McDuck is calling up Hush, because the only person that can probably stop this Sulago character is Darkwing Duck. Now we do find out in the DuckTales chapter, and I think as well as in the Darkwing Duck chapter, more of what's going on, including the recap of the Tailspin chapter and all that. A bit of a recap. So we get into the fifth chapter, the fifth and final chapter, which is the Darkwing Duck chapter. Sulago finally gets both pieces together. He is freed. He proves to be very powerful. It seems that Darkwing doesn't have a chance, but Darkwing finds a way to beat him. He does. He finds a way to reflect his power back at him or something, and thus Sulago is defeated. And they end with a little implage saying at the end of the story. I will provide a link down below so you guys can check it out yourself and get more information than what I'm giving you on The Legend of the Chaos God, which took place a little over 20 years ago. But this here, The Legend of the Chaos God, even though it was a Disney Adventures magazine exclusive, was a story that a lot of Disney Afternoon fans had been waiting to see happen for some time. A lot of fans throughout the history of the Disney Afternoon on television have been wanting to see some kind of crossover. The closest we ever got, of course, was with Gizmo Duck crossing over into Darkwing Duck, along with Launchpad crossing over and being a permanent stay on the show. Gizmo Duck was just a once-in-a-while appearance. But, of course, there were teasers to other potential crossovers as well. We got the potential of we had the potential tease of a Rescue Ranger Darkwing Duck crossover at one point, but that never materialized. But this here is probably the best chance we ever had of a crossover. Now, true, the characters didn't physically meet each other except for maybe, Gizmo Duck, Fenton, Gizmo Duck, if you will, arriving in St. Canard, and that's about it. But we never really physically got any meetups with, the Rescue Rangers or DuckTales, the Rescue Ranger crew and the DuckTales crew and whatnot. We never had anything like that. It was just one continuing on to the other, which was unique for this kind of a crossover because, yes, it was crossing over the Disney Afternoon shows, but crossing them over to the point that you just had to read one story, and then you had to tune in the next one, then you had to read the next month in another story. It's kind of like how, let's say, Marvel does some of their comic book events. Same thing with DC. DC would say, okay, here's part 1 in an issue of Superman, but if you want to see part 2 of this mega event, you got to read Batman. Or if you want to see part 3 after Batman, you got to read Justice League. or you got to read Wonder Woman. Same with Marvel. Marvel did a big event. It's like, okay, here's part one of Spider-Man, but if you want to read part two, you got to read X-Men, or you got to read Captain America, or you got to read, if you want to read part three, you got to read the Avengers, stuff like that. And it's that kind of a story. It was that kind of a story, and that was a unique crossover in itself. The only difference, like I said, between those is you didn't have the characters really physically meet up, except for Fenton going over to St. Canard in the final part for Darkwing Duck, the final part of the story for the Darkwing Duck portion, and that was it. Nowadays, though, sometimes when Disney does a crossover, let's say on television, it's not really that uncommon. You know, you take a look at Lilo and Stitch, the animated series, and you had several crossovers there with Recess, Proud Family, Kim Possible, American Dragon, you name it. You know, you take a look at Jessie crossing over with Ultimate Spider-Man in animated form this past year. So it does happen more often nowadays than it did then. Now this, however, was an event that if they wanted to go physical, full animated television style with it, to me would have really drawn a lot of ratings, would have really drawn a lot of viewers, because you would have to literally, even if you didn't like one show over the other, or you didn't, okay, basically it'd be like if you liked one show over the other, but you didn't like the other show, let's say if you liked Rescue Rangers over Tailspin, but you would watch Tailspin. You would watch Tailspin to see what happens, and then you would tune in the next day to watch Rescue Rangers and DuckTales. You kind of get the idea. It'd be like even if you didn't like DuckTales and you liked Rescue Rangers better, you'd watch DuckTales anyway to see what happens, and then if you like Darkwing Duck over DuckTales, you'd watch it anyway. So that's basically what the Legend of the Chaos God was like. And to me, when I look at the story, I look at a story that potentially could have been more. Now, it was a five-parter. Originally, it was supposed to end with issue 50, but due to the fact that they had to dedicate 2 months and 2 issues worth of Disney Adventure Magazine's comics to a Lion King adaptation back then, it ended in issue 51. Now, to me, they could have done a lot more. They could have added an additional chapter, which really could have been like a prologue, really explored who Sulago was, and that chapter could have involved the gummy bears. So really, you could have gone full circle right there. But they did what they had to, and it turned out to be pretty good. So, but like I said, if there was anything, I would have added at least one chapter to sort of like be a real setup, a real prologue to what we were going to get, and I would have added the gummy bears to that portion. Whether you agree with that or not, it's up to you. The other thing about this was it was the last full-length comic book adventures in Disney Adventure Magazine for Rescue Rangers, DuckTales, and Goof Troop, as far as I know. Well, not Goof Troop, but Rescue Rangers, Tailspin, and DuckTales. So, but you know, really, if you haven't checked out Legend of the Chaos God yet, I will provide a link down below. I'm checking my time there. I got a 15-minute time limit here, but I will provide a link down below if you guys have not checked out Chaos God yet. It'll be a wiki link, and if you can find it, you can probably find it on YouTube in its entirety. You can probably find it in PDF and torrents, but check it out. It's really good. So that's all I'm going to say on it, folks. And again, this is something that I think if they had done more of a physical animated form of, really drawn in a lot of viewers. And I think, just my opinion, could have done a lot more if they had at least one chapter more with the gummy bears and stuff. So that's all I'm going to say. Let me know what you guys think down below, and I'll talk to you all later.